What's up, party people? Today we're going to be taking a look at a bunch of iPhone footage that I shot while I was in Peru. The previous video I posted it on my YouTube channel has the whole edit I put together with it. The edit's nothing special, but it is a really good test of the ProRes Apple Log feature on the new iPhone 15, and I want to just test that while I was traveling. I'm going to be breaking down some of the shots from the actual edit and also just give you my impressions on shooting with the iPhone and also just the quality of the footage overall. Because it's quite impressive what you can pull out of just a phone these days. All the footage was actually colored by a professional colorist, a friend of mine, Cam. You can find links to his stuff down in the description below if you want to check him out. But it was really cool to see what he could actually pull out of the log footage from just an iPhone. Part of the test I wanted to conduct was to see how feasible it was to use these kinds of shots in a super run and gun environment. Because of this, I often opted to not use an ND filter. I did 3D print this little case that fits on the outside that you can put a little 52mm VND on, but I actually ended up not using it very much. And that's mostly because when you're shooting on a phone, you want it to be super convenient and super easy. If I'm having to pull extra things out of my bag to screw on filters, to add extra accessories or whatever, to me it kind of defeats the whole purpose of shooting on the phone. Because of that, I ended up sacrificing my ISO and shutter angle quite a bit just to get the exposure that I wanted for the shots. But that was a way more convenient way to do it for me when I was shooting, and frankly, I don't really think you can notice in the final edit. The only thing that might have changed that is the dynamic range, because when you're shooting at around 1250 ISO, you actually get the most dynamic range out of the iPhone in Apple Log. There's a really good video by Gerald Undone and Patrick Tommaso that breaks down the dynamic range capabilities of the phone in Apple Log. I'll leave a link to that down in the description below. But like I said, I was just trying to be super run and gun with this and just make it as convenient as possible. Okay, so what are my thoughts after having shot with this for 20 days while traveling? Firstly, the main camera is definitely the one to shoot on. The bigger sensor and just the way they've tuned it, I don't know if it's software or hardware or what, but the footage from the main sensor looks a lot better than from the other two cameras. I just have the normal 15 Pro, so it's the 3x lens or 77mm equivalent lens, not the extra 5x one for the big phone. I just personally don't like carrying around a big phone. But I really found in shooting that unless you feed the tight lens or the ultra wide lens a lot of light, they're gonna fall apart pretty quickly in comparison to the main wide angle lens. The best example of this is in the nighttime section of the edit, where we go into some shots of my friend Joey sitting by a fire. This first shot here is actually quite surprisingly clean and good. And I believe that Cam, the colorist, did some noise reduction on this, because this just looks super clean to me. I'm really impressed with what came out of the main wide lens in this specific shot. And as we punch into the tighter shot, you can just see how noisy it is. It's noisy around his face. The image just falls apart really quickly when you're not giving it much light. And in this scenario, this was completely dark besides the fire and the headlamp that you see in the shot. And the third fire shot punches back out to the ultra wide lens. And this looks okay to me. It's more like what you'd expect out of a phone camera at night, which honestly is not terrible in this case. But it is really impressive how good the main camera looks in comparison to the other two in this like worst case environment where you have no lights at all lighting the frame besides what's in the frame itself. The other shot I wanted to talk about in terms of low light performance is the shot of him setting up the tent. You can see in the actual frame itself, it's super noisy and grainy. This was shot at like dusk, like there was barely any light in the sky. And I think Cam, the colorist, tried to pull really a lot of that color out of the sky. But what ends up happening when you do that is you end up just sacrificing the shadows, and that's what you see in the bottom left of the frame down here. Just sort of the whole left side of the frame ends up being super noisy, not super usable in a professional environment. I shot all of this footage in the Blackmagic Camera app, which is a super awesome app if you're trying to make movies using a phone. Even if you don't have Apple Log, it just gives you all the settings that you could possibly want. And the menus are very similar to a traditional Blackmagic camera. So if you're familiar with that system, it's just super easy to use. There's also a few different stabilization modes within the app that you can select. I kind of messed around with all three of them. There's no stabilization, and then there's like a medium and a cinematic mode, they call it, which is like ultra stabilized. Depending on the type of shot I was doing, I swapped between a few of them, although I do believe it crops resolution a little bit on the most extreme version of the stabilization. Sometimes that messed up the footage a little bit and got a little jerky and janky, which to me was kind of similar to using a camera with in-body image stabilization. If you're familiar, like when you pan or tilt too quickly on one of those, the movement just feels kind of robotic and weird. That said, if you do a nice ninja walk while moving and filming, you can get some good shots out of it that look really buttery smooth. Because there's no weight behind the camera, you can't really get an authentic handheld look, so having those modes that help you stabilize the footage ended up being pretty helpful. Having looked at the footage now after going through the edit and going through the color grade, I'm super impressed with what you can pull out of this thing. The only other gripe I had after looking at this footage was just the dynamic range, which again, if I had been shooting at the optimal ISO of around 1250 and used NDs, that might have been a little bit better. But the truth is you're not going to be able to pull a lot more out of it just because of the nature of the size of the sensor, which also affects the low light footage like we talked about earlier. And it just makes it look a little bit cheaper than something like a really nice cinema camera. But that's a super important thing to keep in mind, is that we are comparing this to super high-end cinema cameras. I'm often shooting on ARRI or RED, which obviously are like the cream of the crop of what you can get in terms of cameras. So the fact that this is even being compared to that is kind of ridiculous in the first place. Overall, I'm super impressed with what you can pull out of this. I think that especially shooting on the main camera with enough light, you can get a really, really beautiful image out of this. The downfalls are that you don't have the same shallow depth of field that you can get out of a main camera just because the sensor and the lenses are so small. And the other downsides being when you don't have optimal environments, the tight and ultra wide lenses pretty much become unusable. That said, when they do have enough light, you can get a little bit more depth of field by shooting on the tighter lens and having your subject close to you and your background really far away. And there's some nice example shots of that in the edit, which again, I will leave a link to in the description or up above if you haven't seen that yet. What inspired me to want to get this phone and test out the log footage from it is actually a shot that's in a previous video I made surrounding shooting with Casey Neistat for a Lululemon commercial. There's a shot in that video where we actually handed him a phone to film himself riding a boosted board, which was a very Casey Neistat thing to do. But in the shot, we only had an iPhone 13 Pro, I believe it was, and the sky in the background is totally blown out. And while the colorist on that job did a really good job of hiding that and making the sky look super natural, it pained me a lot to have an overexposed shot in the final edit. And if we had had something like Apple Log and ProRes on the iPhone 15, who knows whether that would have been possible to recover or not with that extra dynamic range and the log profile. If you're just starting out in filmmaking and are needing to buy a new phone anyway, this could be a good way to learn the basics. There's a lot of fundamentals that you can get with this that are super, super awesome. Obviously, having a professional colorist grade your footage is going to elevate it a lot more, but I found that was a good way to test sort of the latitude you can get out of the colors and out of the dynamic range of this to push it to the very edges. If you're just starting out though, and you only have access to something small like this, absolutely you could make an entire short film or movie or commercial or whatever on this. It's more about the creative vision that you have than the gear at the end of the day, which obviously is easy to say, but because phones are getting so good, you pretty much have no excuse to not get out there and go be creative and make something awesome. If you got some value out of this video, click the like button down below because it actually makes a difference and helps spread this video to people who might be interested in iPhone filmmaking. While you're down there, click the subscribe button if you want to see more filmmaking videos just like this one, and I'll see you guys in the next video.